Chapter 16. Regulation Overview, Current Good Manufacturing Practice, Hazard Analysis, and Risk-Based Preventive Controls for Human Food. This chapter serves as a review of many of the requirements that were covered in previous chapters, presented by David Rossin. On September 17, 2015, the FDA's final regulation on current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food was published. The regulation focuses on a preventive approach to food safety and is known as the Preventive Controls for Human Food Regulation. We refer to it as the regulation for the rest of this chapter. A copy of the entire text of the regulation is found in Appendix 1 of this manual. This course was developed to assist human food establishments with developing and implementing risk-based preventive controls that comply with the regulation. In some sections of the course, the information provided goes beyond what is in the regulation to assist with implementation of a robust food safety plan. The specific provisions and regulatory citations for the regulatory requirements are included here in an overview of the regulation. If the facility has specific questions on interpretation, they can use the FDA's Food Safety Modernization Act, FSMA Technical Assistance Network, which will be reviewed later in this chapter. By the end of this chapter, participants will be able to describe the major components, including requirements, of the current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food regulation. Explain how to determine applicability of the requirements based on the food facility type. Identify exemptions and modified requirements applicable to certain facilities. The regulation generally applies to both domestic facilities and foreign facilities that export food for consumption in the United States. Facilities required to register with the FDA under Section 415 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act are subject to both the good manufacturing practices and the hazard analysis and preventive controls for human food requirements. Registration is not required for restaurants and retail food establishments, so the Pcqi requirements do not apply to restaurants and retail food establishments. GMPs generally apply to entities that manufacture, process, pack, or hold human food for consumption in the United States, regardless of whether the entity is a facility required to register. There are a number of exemptions and modified requirements, mostly with respect to Subpart C on hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. In the chapter resources and in a subsequent presentation is the FSPCA's Form 0064, Preventive Controls for Human Food, Food Facility Type, and Applicable Regulations Table. The purpose of the FSPCA Form 0064 is to show which subparts of 21 CFR Part 117 apply to different food facility types as well as other applicable regulations. The current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food regulation is found in 21 CFR Part 117. It has 7 subparts as shown here. Subpart A, General Provisions. Subpart B, Current Good Manufacturing Practice. Subpart C, Hazard Analysis and Risk-Based Preventive Controls. Subpart D, Modified Requirements. Subpart E, Withdrawal of a Qualified Facility Exemption. Subpart F, Requirements applying to records that must be established and maintained. Subpart G, Supply Chain Program. Subpart A discusses applicability of the regulation to different facilities, defines terms used in the regulation, addresses qualifications for individuals who manufacture, process, pack, or hold food, and identifies exemptions from specific regulatory requirements for certain situations. It also updates definitions in other parts of the Code of Federal Regulations, such as clarifying what constitutes on-farm manufacturing, packing, and holding of food in 21 CFR Part 1. It also defines a small and very small business, which have different compliance dates. These updates were required by the Food Safety Modernization Act's Section 103, 21 CFR Part 117, specifically Section 117.4, has the requirements for training applicable to all establishments that manufacture, process, pack, or hold food. Individuals must have the education, training, or experience, or combination of these, necessary to manufacture, process, pack, or hold clean and safe food as appropriate to the individual's assigned duties. Individuals must receive training in the principles of food hygiene and food safety, as appropriate to the food, the facility, and the individual's assigned duties. Records are required for food hygiene and food safety training. These training records are subject to the general requirements in Subpart F, Section 117.305. Qualified facilities are exempt from the requirements for hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. These are essentially very small businesses and include a business, including affiliates and subsidiaries, that averages less than $1 million in total annual sales of human food, plus the value of human food held without sale, e.g., for a fee, as is the case for a warehouse, adjusted for inflation. The QR code in the participant covering this slide links to FDA's FSMA, Inflation Adjusted Cutoffs webpage. Qualified facilities are still subject to the GMPs and are subject to attestation requirements in Section 117.201. This means that they will need to submit a form to FDA confirming the business's status as a qualified facility, e.g., that they remain under the sales limits and that the facility is either implementing preventive controls to address hazards associated with its food or is in compliance with non-federal food safety laws and regulations. Facilities such as warehouses that store only unexposed packaged food are exempt from the requirements in subparts C and G. However, certain packaged food for which refrigeration is required for safety must have temperature controls, monitoring, verification, and records. They are subject to good manufacturing practices unless an exemption applies. See FSPCA's Form 0064, Preventive Controls for Human Food, Food Facility Type, and applicable regulations table to identify which subparts of 21 CFR Part 117 apply to facilities solely engaged in the storage of unexposed packaged food. The regulation provides an exemption for the following: food subject to seafood or juice, HACCP regulations 117.5 B and C, dietary supplements 117.5 E, alcoholic beverages 117.5 I, food subject to produce safety requirements 117.5 F, food subject to low acid canned food regulations only with respect to microbiological hazards 117.5 D. Check out the FSPCA's Form 0064, Preventive Controls for Human Food, Food Facility Type and applicable regulations, table to identify which subparts of 21 CFR Part 117 apply to these facility types. Certain storage facilities, such as grain elevators and warehouses that only store raw agricultural commodities other than fruits and vegetables, intended for further distribution or processing, are exempt from hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls. FSMA provided FDA with authority to exempt or modify requirements for storage of raw agricultural commodities, RACs intended for further distribution or processing, but specifically excluded storage of fruits and vegetables. Farm mix type facility related exemptions include certain low risk manufacturing, processing, packing, and holding activities conducted by small, very small businesses on farms for specific foods. The regulation includes an exhaustive list, and the exemption only applies if these are the only activities they conduct that were subject to the registration requirement. See FSPCA's Form 0064, Preventive Controls for Human Food. Food facility, type, and applicable regulations. Table to identify which subparts of 21 CFR, Part 117, apply to these facility types. The different sections of Subpart B, the CGMPs, are shown on this slide. Requirements for personnel, plant and grounds, sanitary operations, sanitary facilities and controls, equipment and utensils, processes and controls, warehousing and distribution, and defect action levels are addressed under GMP provisions. In addition, a new provision was added for holding and distribution of human food byproducts for use as animal food. GMP provisions are not the focus of this course on hazard analysis, and preventive controls. The new provision in Section 117.95 pertains to GMPs for holding and distribution of human food byproducts for use as animal food. Human food manufacturers hold and distribute human food byproducts without further manufacturing are not subject to the preventive controls for preventive food regulation. For animal food regulations produced in compliance food is produced GMPs, compliance with GMPs are not further processed and are not further byproducts must be held. But the byproducts must be held in a manner that protects against contamination, identified as human food byproducts for use as animal byproducts during holding use as animal food during holding and distribution. The focus of this training program is on 21 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 117, Subpart C, Hazard Analysis and Risk-Based Preventive Controls for Human Food, referred to as Preventive Controls for Human Food Regulation in this document, and Subpart G, Supply Chain Program. Each facility is required to implement a written food safety plan that focuses on significantly minimizing or preventing hazards in foods, 21 CFR, Part 117, Section 117.126. We have covered in more detail the requirements in Subpart C in the individual chapters pertaining to each section. Here's a high-level summary of the requirements. Every facility subject to Subpart C must have a written food safety plan that includes written hazard analysis, written preventive control procedures, including monitoring, corrective actions, and verification, as applicable. Written process preventive procedures must include validation, written supply chain program, written recall plan, monitoring, corrective actions, and verification, as applicable, must be documented in records. The facility must have a preventive controls qualified individual prepare or oversee the preparation of the food safety plan, validation, review of records, and reanalysis. A preventive controls qualified individual is required to, among other things, develop or oversee preparation of the food safety plan, validation of the preventive controls, review of records, and reanalysis of the food safety plan. Additional tasks that must be performed or overseen by a preventive controls qualified individual involve written justification in situations where expected timeframes for certain activities are not met. These include justification for completing validation activities after 90 days of first production or determining that validation is not required, justification for review of monitoring and corrective action records exceeding 7 working days, and determining that it is appropriate to perform reanalysis and validation of additional preventive controls in a period longer than the first 90 days of production. There are two ways to become a preventive controls qualified individual. The first way is to successfully complete training in the development and application of risk-based preventive controls, such as attending this training class and successfully completing the exercises. The second way is for an individual to be qualified through job experience to develop and implement a food safety plan. If qualified by training, the training must be documented in records, including the date of the training, type of training, and the persons trained. The preventive controls qualified individual may be, but is not required to be, an employee of the facility. This person can be an external consultant. There are modified requirements for certain facilities, such as very small businesses, AEs, a qualified facility, or warehouses that solely engage in storage of unexposed packaged food. These modified requirements are addressed in 21 CFR Part 117, Subpart D. Consult this section if the facility is a qualified facility. A brief discussion of requirements that apply to facilities solely engaged in storage of unexposed packaged food follows. Subpart D contains the provisions for modified requirements that apply to a qualified facility and that apply to a facility solely engaged in the storage of unexposed packaged food that requires time temperature control for safety. Qualified facilities. A very small business is a qualified facility. Are exempt from subparts C and G, but are subject to subparts A, B, D, E, and F. Must submit attestations as described in Section 1, 17.201. Facilities solely engaged in the storage of unexposed packaged food. Warehouse that requires time temperature control for safety. Are exempt from subparts C and G, but are subject to subparts A, B, D, and F, unless another exemption applies. Must comply with requirements for temperature control and monitoring, as described in Section 1, 17.206. C. FS Pcaqi Form 0064. Preventive controls for human food. Food facility. Type and applicable regulations. Table to identify which subparts of 21 CFR, Part 117, apply to these facility types. A qualified facility must submit the following attestations to FDA as outlined in Subpart D, Section 1, 17.201. An attestation that the facility is a qualified facility as defined in Section 117.3. For the purpose of determining whether a facility satisfies the definition of qualified facility, the baseline year for calculating the adjustment for inflation is 2011, see QR code next to slide 7, and an attestation that the facility has identified the potential hazards associated with the food being produced, are implementing preventive controls to address the hazards, and are monitoring the performance of the preventive controls to ensure that such controls are effective, or an attestation that the facility is in compliance with state, local, county, city, or regional, tribal, or other applicable non-federal food safety law, including relevant laws and regulations of foreign countries, including an attestation based on licenses, inspection reports, certificates, permits, credentials, certification by an appropriate agency, such as a State Department of Agriculture, or other evidence of oversight. For facilities that are solely engaged in the storage of refrigerated packaged food, e.g. refrigerated storage warehouses, there are requirements for time, temperature control, if the product can support pathogen growth or toxin production. These include monitoring temperatures and taking corrective action when appropriate. Verification activities related to temperature monitoring also apply. In Section 117.206A4, there is a requirement to verify that temperature controls are consistently implemented by I. Calibrating temperature monitoring and recording devices, or checking them for accuracy. Reviewing records of calibration within a reasonable time after the records are created. And reviewing records of monitoring and corrective actions taken to correct a problem with the control of temperature within 7 working days after the records are created, or within a reasonable time frame, provided that the preventive controls qualified individual prepares or oversees the preparation of a written justification for a time frame that exceeds 7 working days. 21. CFR Part 117. Subpart E describes the circumstances, procedures, and requirements for withdrawing a qualified facility exemption. If the facility believes that they are a qualified facility, the facility should become familiar with the provisions for withdrawal and reinstatement of the exemption for qualified facilities. FDA may consider withdrawing the qualified facility exemption when a foodborne illness outbreak is directly linked to the qualified facility. FDA determines it is necessary to protect the public health based on conditions and practices associated with a qualified facility. FDA would only consider pursuing this option in rare circumstances. 21 CFR Part 117. Subpart F describes requirements for records. Records must be kept as original records. True copies, e.g. photocopies, pictures, scanned copies, microfilm, microfiche, or other accurate reproductions of the original, or electronic records. They must contain the actual values and observations obtained during monitoring and, as appropriate, during verification activities. Records must be accurate, indelible, legible, and created concurrently with the activity being documented. Records must be as detailed as necessary to provide a history of the work performed, including adequate information to identify the plant or facility, e.g., the name and, when necessary, the location of the facility, the date and, when appropriate, time of the activity documented, the signature or initials of the person performing the activity, and, where appropriate, the identity of the product and the lot code, if any. The food safety plan must be signed and dated by the owner, operator, or agent in charge of the facility upon initial completion and upon any modification. All required records must be retained at the facility for at least 2 years after the date they were prepared. Records related to the general adequacy of the equipment or processes being used by the facility, including scientific studies and evaluations, must be retained for at least 2 years after their use is discontinued. This applies to food safety plans that are no longer used because they have been updated, validation records for processes no longer used, and potentially other records. Except for the food safety plan, off-site storage of required records is permitted if they can be retrieved and provided on site within 24 hours of a request for official review. Electronic records are considered on site if they can be accessed from an on-site location. All records required must be made promptly available for official review and copying upon oral or written request. Records required are subject to disclosure requirements under 21 CFR Part 20. Existing records, such as records kept to comply with other federal, state or local, county, city, or regional regulations or any other reason, may be used if they contain all the required information. The facility can supplement existing records if they are missing some of the required elements. The facility does not have to keep their records as one set of records. Any new information not on an existing record can be kept separately or combined with the existing records. Any required written assurance, 21 CFR 117.335, related to application of a preventive control elsewhere in the supply chain, see Section 117.136 and Section 117.430, must contain the effective date, printed names and signatures of authorized officials, and relevant information regarding acknowledgement of legal responsibility. Read the section carefully if it applies to the facility. Hazards requiring a preventive control, for which the facility relies on supplier controls, are managed through the facility's supply chain program. 21 CFR Part 117, Subpart G covers requirements to establish and implement a supply chain program, general requirements, responsibilities of the receiving facility, using approved suppliers, determining appropriate verification activities, conducting those activities, on-site audits, and records required for the facility's supply chain program. In summary, requirements for a supply chain program only apply to receiving facilities. Manufacturer, processor subject to subparts C and G that have identified a hazard in a raw material or other ingredient that must be controlled before receipt. Supply chain program must include approving suppliers, written procedures for receiving from approved suppliers or temporarily from unapproved suppliers, written procedures for appropriate supplier verification activities, including frequency, written corrective action procedures, reanalysis of the supply chain program. Records documenting the supply chain program must be established and maintained. There are a number of food safety regulations, in addition to the preventive controls for human food regulations that may apply to food facilities. Food processors should be aware of these requirements, as they may need to be included in a food safety program. For example, seafood and juice products are not subject to certain subparts of the preventive controls for human food regulation, but are subject to GMPs and the seafood and juice HACCP regulations. The USDA pathogen reduction regulation, applicable to meat and poultry establishments, is designed to reduce the occurrence and numbers of pathogenic microorganisms on meat and poultry products, reduce the incidence of foodborne illness associated with the consumption of those products, and provide a new framework for modernization of the current system of meat and poultry inspection. International HACCP regulations apply to food produced in countries outside of the United States. HACCP is an internationally recognized system based on the production of safe food from a preventive approach. The preventive controls for animal food regulation requires animal food facilities to have a food safety plan in place that includes an analysis of hazards to determine which ones need control, and risk-based preventive controls to minimize or prevent those hazards. Produce safety regulations establish science-based minimum standards for the safe growing, harvesting, packing, and holding of fruits and vegetables grown for human consumption. Sanitary food transport regulations establish requirements for shippers, loaders, carriers by motor or rail vehicle, and receivers involved in transporting human and animal food to use sanitary practices to ensure the safety of that food. The current good manufacturing practice, hazard analysis, and risk-based preventive controls for human food regulation is intended to focus preventive controls where they matter most. GMPs are required for all facilities unless an exemption exists. This course focuses on 21 CFR Part 117, Subpart C, hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls for human food, and Subpart G, supply chain program. More detailed information on other provisions can be obtained through other means, such as reading the regulation, see Appendix 1, or through other training programs. Where to go for help? If the facility has questions regarding regulation and policy interpretation questions, submit questions to FDA's FSMA Technical Assistance Network via the online form. The FDA's subject matter experts will address the questions. Also, the FDA FSMA Technical Assistance Network staff has compiled answers to frequently asked questions on FSMA, which may already answer the facility's question. See FSMA FAQ link in the additional reading, resources, and references at the end of the chapter. If a facility has questions about FDA's preventive controls for human inspection process, what to expect, and how best to prepare for an inspection, they can read Appendix 7, which will help in advising on which procedures and records are needed for an FDA inspection based on their process. In addition, this Appendix 7 will describe FDA's regulatory enforcement actions. Wow! You completed Chapter 16, and all the required lectures. Be sure to complete the Chapter 16. Exercises. There is a bonus presentation covering preventive control for human food facility, type and applicable regulations table, Pcqi, Form 64.